Okay? Okay. Morning, everyone. Okay, that's too loud. We need to get the clipping down on this thing a bit. Okay. Morning, everyone. My name is Harry. Welcome to the Intermediate TDD workshop. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate you being here. And I really appreciate all of you doing all the prep required and not sort of installing everything in a panic at the last minute, just like you saw me doing just now. But my laptop, which was really shaky in the last session, has actually finally packed it in. It won't even switch on, so I've had to improvise. Ned, one of my glamorous tutorial assistants, has very kindly lent me his. Thank you, Ned, everyone. Let's give him a big hand. There you go. Thank you to all the other lovely assistants at the back, Mark and Trevor. So they're going to be helping you out. Today we're going to do a bit of an intermediate TDD workshop. And then so just please bear with me if I have some technological issues. Just be silent and try and give me the impression that you're not massively annoyed and bored and rolling your eyes internally. And then we'll get through it. I assure you I've done this all before. Now, would you put your hands up then again if you've never used Django in the room? Just a few people. But you're all happy that the person next to you or a person next to you can answer your Django questions, right? Good. Would you put your hands up if you've never used a mock in a test? Okay. Okay. Put your hands up again, everyone. All right, so I've got 3 people who've never used a mock here. I think that's bad. You should try and find at least one person who has used mocks that can swap into this front row here. Have you used mocks before, sir? Can I get you to swap with someone, maybe the middle person in that row? That would be amazing. There you go. Anybody else that's never used mocks sitting next to someone who's never used mocks? No, good. So that's really required for the second half of this workshop, and that might be done in a bit of a rush anyway, but still, I think we're all going to be okay. Good. So the focus of this workshop is kind of what I think of as an intermediate level test-driven development, and I'm going to start, and it's based loosely on a book that I wrote, which is available in all good bookshops, Test-Driven Development with Python, also known as the GOAT book, which I encourage you all to buy, but if you can't buy it, you can just read it online for free, www.obeythetestinggoat.com, so by all means, come and check that out. And so this is based on some later chapters in the book, maybe around chapters 21 or so, where we've been building an app for a while. It's a Django app. That's why I'm asking questions about Jag. And I'm starting to say, okay, we've built it with tests. There are kind of functional tests, which are high-level tests that open up a real web browser and navigate around. There are low-level tests like unit tests. And then I start to say in these 2 chapters, kind of what order should we do things? When we're kind of programming a new piece of code, assuming maybe we write a functional test first, how do we decide what bit of code to write and in what order and when do I write the tests? And so I propose a couple of different techniques, bottom up versus outside in, and they both have pros and cons. So that's the kind of outside in chapter, which we're going to do in the first part. And then the second part is about mocks. So it's, I've already, mocks are a way of kind of isolating your tests from external influences. And they have a bad reputation, and I think deservedly they're often a source of a lot of pain. And in the sort of second part of the workshop, I want to explore those sources of pain and just see, using this example, can we see what causes the pain, and can we also find some ways of resolving that pain or putting it to good use, converting something evil into something good. So that's the plan. My plan is to do some little demos for you, show you around, and then give you 3 different kind of programming exercises. One's going to be just a real simple, don't worry about tests, hack away and get familiar with this code base. The next one's going to be about outside in. The next one's going to be about mocks. And I think maybe there's a final one, debugging. And I'd like to go at the speed of the slowest person, so I don't want to leave anyone behind. So I'm going to be running around, and my assistants will be running around, making sure that everyone's catching up. But to really do that with a room, I think we've got 56 people in here, or possibly more. So what I'd like to propose to you, which is optional, I don't want to force anyone to do it, is that we do pair programming today. So TDD, as you probably know, grew out of extreme programming and agile development in general, and AXP, extreme programming, always suggested that everything be done in pairs. So if you're prepared to pair up with the person next to you, that means that instead of 56 people with 56 sets of possible mistakes and bugs and gotchas going through this tutorial and thus going at the speed of the 56th slowest person, we will only have 28 people, and we should be able to get through it twice as fast. So if it's okay, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the person next to you, pick one of the 2 laptops, which will be the primary laptop, pick a text editor that you're going to use. Please don't inflict Vim or Emacs on somebody that's never used them before. And then make sure that during this pair programming exercise, I want you to swap whose who's driving, like who's typing the code, and who's thinking. And in general, pair programming encourages the person who's not typing should be thinking about the problem and giving tips and suggestions on what to do next on the person who's typing. And the person who's typing is just concentrating on getting the syntax right and typing into the editor correctly. And we swap every so often and do those two jobs. So that's what I'd like to propose. Does everyone sound like they might be up for that? What about a warm, enthusiastic yes? All right. There you go. So 3s are okay if you're prepared to go for a 3. The other thing is, if you pick one laptop and just concentrate as a group on getting it all working on that laptop, and then once that's done, you'll probably find you've got a bit of time to jump onto your own one and maybe do it slightly differently. So once you've picked the primary laptop, just do that one first, get it all working, make sure you swap who's typing every so often, and then you'll probably have 5 or 10 minutes to go back to your own laptop and do it. The other thing I should mention is if you feel like, oh, it's not on my laptop, I didn't really get to do it, you shouldn't feel bad about that. Shh. Shouldn't feel bad about that, because all of this is based on my book, and you can go, when you get home tonight, go and check out the chapters in my book on this topic, outside in and test isolation, and you can just work through that in your own time and really make sure that you internalize those lessons, especially if you buy a copy of the book, but you don't have to, it's free online as well. Did I mention I wrote a book? Fine, so that's that. Is there anything else that I want to work? Yes, so the final thing is every so often I'm going to do things and I'm going to go, right, does everyone get it? Is that okay? Is that okay? And I'll look around at you expectantly. And so please don't do this if what's in your head is, okay, so if you're confused, I know we all do this, we sometimes think, gosh, I'm a bit confused about what he's saying. Maybe I'll just wait and in a minute it will make more sense. Sometimes that happens, but more often than not, you just get, it doesn't make any more sense later, and you get more and more lost, and you're just disconnected and lost. So please, if you have a question, ask it immediately. Guess what? If you have a question, you're embarrassed, you think it might be a stupid question. It's not a stupid question, I guarantee it. I give prizes for the most stupid questions. But more importantly, probably there's 2 or 3 other people in the room who have the exact same question, and they will be dead grateful that you asked it. That does not mean that you should wait for somebody else to ask the question. Just ask it yourself. Please ask those questions. Make sure that you understand where I am at every stage of this. Good. Any questions before we start? Remember, there are prizes. Prizes. Yeah, a question. No. What? Are we sorry? Are you really getting prizes? Yes! I used to be able to give out like little discount stickers and stuff, and I haven't got them anymore. You could have business card. Yeah. I can tell you, I'll break all the copyright rules and give you a free PDF if you come and ask me. There you go. Great. So yes, of course there are prizes. I would not lie about that. Great. All right, shall we make a start? So first I'm going to give you, so you've all got, and have you all had a chance to have a look around at the example application, which is a to-do lists website? Yes? So I'm just going to run it over here. And have a little look at it. Localhost 8000. Not localhost8000.com. Oh, God. All right, this is our to-do list website. I use the example of a to-do list website because that's what everybody uses, and I have no imagination. But it's also just quite a nice, simple example. It has a database. It has a little bit of structure to it. And so I might go buy milk. Great. And then buy bread. Okay, so I can simply add items to a to-do list. And the way this works in the background is we have a models layer that basically has an item which represents an item in a to-do list. That just has a text field to hold what the item is, buy milk, buy bread, whatever. And then it has a foreign key to a list. And this allows the system to have several different lists. There's a list for this user, a list for that user, different lists. So list number 1, list number 2. And then the list class is really just a table with one column, which is a list ID, essentially. But we might make it more complicated later. Don't worry about this get absolute URL thing or any of these bits and pieces. The general idea is there's a list, and a list can have multiple items. There could be multiple lists, each of which can have multiple items. Does that make sense so far? Remember, Questions win prizes. Okay. So the next level up in our sort of architecture is the views layer. The views are the functions, if you've not used Django, that process requests from the user. So it takes a request, it returns a response, which is usually a rendered template. And the home page just fetches a template called home.html, displays it to the user. That home page has got a form which the user can submit a new item. We then have a single view and URL for creating a brand new list. And the way that works is it creates a form. Forms are in charge of validation. Instantiates that form. If the user input is valid, it creates and redirects to a new list. Else it shows some errors to the user. So if they've tried to start a list with an empty first item, it will show an error. You don't need to worry about the forms for this part of the tutorial. And then finally, we have the view list view, and this is the job of this view is to do existing lists. So it can either display an existing list, or it can process a post request to add an item to an existing list. And you can see it will either display a list with a list object and render it in the form, or it will handle a post request, add a new item to that list by calling form.save, and then redirect to the list. Okay, so far. Okay. I'm seeing a lot of nodding, so remember what I said. List templates, home.html. So the template structure is based on list templates. There's a base template which contains all the kind of boilerplate HTML, and then the home page has the home, which just says there's just a form, and the list page has not just a form, but also a table with rows. So that's lists, that's views, that's templates. Okay, we're done. So the objective for today is I want to transform this website so that it has, I wonder if I can do this by just doing a checkout. Intermediate, when it's going to do master. Sorry about that. Okay, get this. Chapter CI. Okay, I've got a run server over here. Let's restart that. Okay. So if I log in here, I've just hacked the, oh, have I though? No, I haven't. All right, I'll just talk you through it. So what we're going to do is we want to have the ability, so from our users, to actually save their own list. So at the moment, the website has no facility for knowing who's doing what. And what users are saying is, fine, you've got a to-do list website, anyone can log in and create a to-do list, and they can save the URL and add new items to it. But we're imagining, let's add a new feature whereby if a user is logged in, which they can do by just typing their email into that login box, then whenever they create a list, the system remembers that that list is associated with them somewhere, and it keeps track of all of the lists that belong to a particular user. And I want to build a new page on this site, which is probably going to have a new view and a new URL and a new template to display the lists that belong to a specific user, and just those lists. So that's the first coding challenge I'd like to give you, which is jump into this code, add a new view, a new URL, and a new template, and make some changes probably at the database layer. So if you're going to associate lists with users, you're probably going to need some sort of foreign key between the list model and the user model. And then you're also going to need to keep track of when you're creating a new list. If the user is logged in, then you need to save the list owner onto the list object you've created. And if they're not authenticated, then you just ignore that. And that should give you the functionality and the bits and pieces you need to create a new page that displays a particular user's lists. The final requirement is like, how are you going to display a list on a page? My suggestion is just name it after the first item. So if I have a My Lists page, this would be a list called Buy Milk. And if I start a new list that goes Go to the Shops, that would be the Go to the Shops list. Because you're going to want to be able to click on that list to get to this page. And what will it be called? What's the name of a list? It may as well be the name of the first item. So that is your job. Just try and hack together a page with a new models and foreign key relationship, and a new view, and a new URL, and a new template for displaying a particular user's list if they're logged in. And It is now 13:41, so I want to give you about 25 to 30 minutes to do that. And the primary objective here is just to get familiar with the code base, wrap your heads around how all this stuff hangs together. And I am here to answer questions, as are Mark and Trevor and Ned. Questions before we start? Yes? Yeah, good question. If you're using, if you're using manage.py run server, it will update automatically. The exception is if you make database changes, you would need to create a database migration with the Django migrations command if your person says, yeah, and you need to run that migrate command manually. And then you need to restart the run server. But for small code changes like changing a template or changing a variable in a view, it should refresh immediately, and next time you hit refresh, you'll see it live. Good question. Any more questions before we start? Okie dokie. Go! There's prizes for whoever finishes it first. Just hack it about. Don't worry too much. Don't worry about testing at all. There is the current failing functional test. If you get this more or less right, will pass. And if you finish this early, think about how you might add tests for it. Are you guys going to pair together? Yeah. Would you guys like to swap? Could you just hop down to, or how are you going to do that? What would be the best way? You're going to go over there? Okay, great. If you guys slide up this way a little bit. Do you want some help? I'll carry your chair. There we go. Thank you. That is awesome. I think you can probably just slide along. Yeah, don't you think? All right, thanks, you guys. 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check. Okay, everyone! You've had lots and lots of time. Hi, I'm sorry. It's the shouty guy at the front of the room again. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. Over here. I'm looking at you guys at the front. Up. Okay, great. How far did you get? Anyone get almost to the end of completing it? I know one group at D's did. Yep. Did you finish? Did you finish? Pretty much? Congratulations. Well done. So you can always complete the rest of this in your own time. But we have half an hour left before the break. And what I'd next to do next is a little demonstration of outside-in TDD. Then we'll have the break, and we'll talk about a more purist approach and mocks in the second half. So when you did this, how many people went and changed models.py as the first place they, sort of instinctively went to go and change? Yep. Now, partially that's because I prompted you to do that by putting it as the first tip on the list, and keep on saying that. But actually, what I would call that is the bottom-up approach. So you, as a programmer, you look at a problem, and you analyze it, and you try and think of it in terms of fundamental concepts. Like, right, well, if I want to capture lists that belong to a user, I'm going to need to have some sort of relationship between lists and users, or otherwise I can't get off the ground. Guys, over here. Right, so your first instinct is like, okay, right, well, at the most fundamental basis, this cannot possibly work unless I have a relationship between lists and users. So let me get into that, the data side of things, and I'll go and get that working. And once I've got that working, then I've got a solid foundation, and then I can, in the various views that need to use the relationship between lists and users, I can start making it work. And that's a nice, reassuring way of coding, because you know that you've solved... Over here, guys. Hi. Sorry, I apologize. If you had important texts, I shouldn't have interrupted you like that. That was just my ego wanting you there, so I apologize. All right, so it's nice and reassuring to feel like you've solved the most fundamental problem first, and then that each of the different layers of your software can build on something stable. But what I want to show you as an alternative is an approach called outside-in, which encourages us to do the other thing. So have you ever found yourself working in this sort of bottom-up way where you go into the models layer and you go, right, okay, I need a foreign key relationship between lists and users. Oh, and while I'm at it, I'm going to have the option to have like some sort of title. Oh, and maybe in the relationship between lists and users, I might have the option to say this is a new user or this is an existing user, or maybe this user has more than one list. So I'll make some helpful helper functions on the user object that says, give me all the lists, or tell me if they're a new user, or tell me if they've never created a list. And you create a bunch of stuff at your sort of lower level layers that you think you're going to lead later. And then you come along and you do the rest of your programming and you come back to look at all the stuff that you've created, and you realize either A, you hadn't quite anticipated your future requirements properly, or B, you've written a bunch of code that you would never end up using. And as we all know, unused code is just a source of bugs. And so that's the kind of pitfalls of that approach, is you've got this danger of writing the wrong code, or code that has the API that's not quite as convenient as you thought it was going to be, or just writing unused code. And the approach I'm going to encourage you towards is outside in, or to consider. It doesn't have to be the approach you use every time. Is that you can actually work the other way around and build your application from the outside inwards. And so I'm going to spend maybe 20 minutes now just trying to do a little bit of a demonstration of outside in programming of this feature using test-driven development, and you'll see how it kind of marries quite nicely with the types of tests that I've set up in this project. So did anyone see the functional tests or try and run them? Yeah. Did you anyone get them passing, by the way? That was a sort of bonus point. Test functional. No, test my list. I think that's it. So this test here pops up a Firefox window, navigates in, creates a couple of lists. First list, second item, a bit slowly sometimes. Yeah, so slowly, in fact, that it's sometimes broken. So I've written a functional test that says, okay, if a user creates a couple of lists and they're logged in, they should later be able to click on a part of the UI and maybe view their own lists and see that they're on a page that's about their lists and so on. One of the ways to do outside in is just to follow what your tests are doing. When I say outside, okay, that should not be passing at the moment. Oh, it's because I did a checkout of the, okay. Immediate workshop start. So this is in functional test list.py. Can we get any colors in this? Apparently not. So this is a test whose job it is to basically do those things, create a new list, create a couple of new lists, and then the first thing it does is it tries to find a new element on the page called mylists, which is the mylists link that you guys added to the base.html template to the navbar there. The user's going to try and click on that, and then there's the next thing the test says is, okay, when they get onto this new page, they should see their email address displayed at them, like this is the list for this user. The next thing it does is it says, okay, well, I'm expecting the lists that I've created to appear on this page as links, as clickable links, named after the first item in the list. So that's the test that's currently failing, and the point at which it's failing is at saying that there's not even any such thing as a link in the top of the page to click on. And so in our architecture, what does it mean to say outside in? Well, we have the outside layer is kind of the GUI layer, the presentational layer, so your HTMLs and your templates, the bits that the user can interact with. Then the next layer down is your view functions, so the things that process user requests and render templates. The next layer down is perhaps the forms layer, the things that do validation. Didn't actually matter for today's exercise, but conceptually it's a layer. And then the bottom layer is our models layer. And we're going to see if we can write this code backwards, kind of do the outside layers first. So at the moment, the current problem, and the way we'll do it is by just working incrementally and just doing the minimal thing that's going to make the functional test a little bit happier. And so the very first thing I can do is to go into my templates, and I'm going to make just a link up here. I've got the log out one. I can make this, and I can go change in quotes. I'm going to make it a do nothing one. Right, lists. Who can remember whether there's a capital letter or not? So this is a pretty dumb thing, but and it's also kind of boring. Because I'm doing, like, the thing about going into that models and creating that foreign key relationship and creating helper functions is that's kind of exciting, fun code, whereas adding extra links to a navbar in base.html is sort of boring. So it's not the bit that you really want to do. But it's dumb code, so you may as well do it first. You may as well get this piping first, and a bunch of dumb errors where you'll get them out of the way, and we can get on to the exciting stuff with confidence that our tests are pushing in this right direction, and we're not just failing because I've wired up a URL with the wrong kind of syntax or something. So the functional tests are a little bit slow on here, so I need to slow down the max weight, which is going to live in functional test base.py. Max weight equals 10. So now, okay, at the very least, it's going to find a link that it can click on, and it's going to get to the next stage in the functional test. And this also gives me feedback that the functional tests are written correctly, because they get a little bit further through, and it tells me I haven't got any bugs in my FT as well as being able to wire up dumb GUI code. So fine, it's clicked on a link, the link goes nowhere, and now it's saying, all right, I am not finding my username on this supposed new page. And that's because that new page doesn't exist yet. So the next concept I'm going to talk about is programming by wishful thinking. So what have we got here? Base.html. So what I want to be able to do over here is, and I'm going to basically drive the requirements for the layer below the one that I'm working on at the current layer. So I'm going to basically think about the API that I need from the layers that support me before I actually write it. So over here, I'm going to say, okay, well, it would be convenient to be able to have the URL for a mylist page in here. So inside this, I can go, okay, fine, it's going to be a %URL. What kind of name am I going to give it? I'm going to give it this. And so notice that I'm giving it a name that makes sense from the point of view of the template. I'm seeing it in the context of all the other places where we kind of call the URL function. And then I have the option of saying, oh, either it doesn't need any arguments or it does. Well, let's say that you want to be able to, one user could view another user's lists. I'm going to put user.email in here. Okay. So, sorry. Oh, yes, thank you. This is the, as everyone knows, the easiest two-finger touch typing combination known to man. Right pinky, left pinky finger, right pinky finger, curly bracket, right pinky finger, left index finger, 5. Thank you very much, Django template language authors. Does anybody know? Did somebody else come up with that? Who should we curse for this particular thing? I feel like there was some predating convention about syntaxes. Anyway, it's evil. So we have this over here, and now I think we're probably going to find that the unit tests are going to fail because I've started using a URL that doesn't exist yet. No, okay. If I run the functional test, I'll now see the server erroring because it can't render the home page anymore because I'm trying to use a URL that doesn't exist yet. But the good thing is I've done that kind of first step at the UI layer, at the presentational layer, and it's forcing me to go ahead and do another thing at the layer below. And the thing I need to do at the layer below is, okay, fine, I need to have some sort of URL and some sort of URL for displaying lists, and I'm going to probably have a template and a view for it. So urls.py. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say it's my lists. And in my version, I'm going to say, OK, yeah, it's going to capture dot plus the email address in here, something like that. And it's going to be called my lists. Fine. And so again, here I'm driving some requirements from the layer below. And I think now if I run my unit test, it'll complain there's no such thing. And that's going to force me to go to listviews.py. Oh. Who knows the syntax for changing Vim into spaces instead of tabs? Set soft tab, something like that? Span tab. Equals true like that? Okay. Span. Yep, sorry, with a beep. And then set TS equals 4, something like that. We'll see if it works. Okay. Oh, nobody can be bothered to do all that stuff. Okie dokie. So I've started saying, OK, now I've got a URL. And so now I'm justified in saying, OK, well, the next step I want to be able to do, so now I've got a thing that you could click on, but it's still going to display an error if the user ever clicks through it. And my functional test will fail with a slightly different error saying, probably like Django error does not contain the text edith@email.com. So I'm going to be justified in saying, OK, well, now we can move down. We've done URLs, which is a kind of one layer further down. We're going to get into the views layer. And here's the stage at which I write my first new unit test. Test views. OK. So it's going to be not too dissimilar from the home page test. I'll put it over down here. My lists page test. And change that. My lists template. There we go. So it's going to be my lists.html. And here, if I was being sensible, I would do some sort of deduplication by doing a reverse function, but I'm just going to hard code it for now. I think it was my lists. And then I need some sort of email in here, don't I? So that's going to be like user. Maybe it's like a@v.com/. So here. All right, so assuming I get some sort of, so that's my first test at the next level down, and that's going to drive me building just a dumb view. And again, not very glamorous code, I'm just really building the piping here, but it's making sure that all the little moving parts all fit together. So fine, that's going to force me to lists views.py, okay, let's do something deliberately stupid, like we'll render home.html. You're quite right about that soft tab. What, set sts equals 4, what was the other thing? Sts equals 4. Set indent width. Whatever. Fantastic. I built a deliberate mistake in there. Okay, it's not using my lists, it's using home.html. Okay, Control Z, whatever. Could you put your control key in a more convenient place, please, Ned? Shoop. Fine, now we have no template. Templates, and we're going to go maybe base it on home.html, sav, lists, template, my lists.html. Curly. So I'm just getting a bunch of boilerplate out of the way. And now I can go back to running my functional tests and seeing if they might get me a little bit further. Test my... what will happen at this point, everyone? Who's following? What's the expected failure? You should sort of have an idea of the expected failure if you're lucky, whenever you're running a test. Now, I think at the moment, I've created a URL and I've created a view for my list, but I've not populated with it anything useful. And so it's saying, okay, great. Now when I click through to my list page, I'm getting a page, but it's blank. So I need it to at least show the user's email. And I think that was in, we need the header text. Let's put that in here. Change to a curly. We can go user.email in here. Come on, little guy. Let's see what he's doing. Shoop. All right, fantastic. So we've got past that. It's now displaying the user's email in there. And I've done a bunch of sort of boring work is now out of the way, and I can get on with something slightly more glamorous. So it can't find first list, first item, because it's not managed to make any kind of relationship between the user and the list. And this is the stage at which I might start thinking, okay, maybe I should go down to the models layer now and start putting that foreign key in. No. We can actually still stay at the views layer and say, all right, well, if I want to have a relationship between a list and a user, the place that that is actually going to get instantiated is when I create a new list. So before even going into the models layer, I'm going to have some sort of code in here about if request.user.is authenticated. So I can actually write a test for this level before going down to the next layer. And that's going to be in the new list test. Let's go maybe shoop, something like that. Test saves list owner for authenticated user. And so this is the place where I'm going to go, oops, self.client.force login. So I'm going to need a user over here. User.objects.create at b.com. And then I've got a slightly dumb invocation for loading up the user, which is from Django. Contrib.auth import get user model. And user equals get user model. Shout out if you ever spot me writing a typo in here, everyone. Ah! I'm not expecting that to pass. Who didn't pick up on the deliberate mistake? Did I not put anything in that test? Yeah, you're right. I did just call it. So I'm in self.client.force login, that's okay. Self.post, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to say new list equals list.objects.get. And I'm going to say self.occur equal new list.owner, user. Okay. All right. And so now it's saying, okay, list has no attribute owner. And this, I say only now, once I've finished writing all of the implementation in my sort of views layer, all of the implementations at my templates layer, all of the tests in my views layer, and now I'm forced to go down to the models layer because I can't really get this test to pass unless I'm able to have a foreign key relationship between lists and users. Or can I? So I want you to just put a pin in this particular moment in the outside-in story, and we're going to come back and revisit that after the break. So here, I'm going to say, okay, fine, I am now forced to get down to my models layer. So I'm going to go test models, and test can have owner. Owner equals user, BP. And I'm going to borrow this user creation code, pop that in there. I'm going to borrow these imports of creating the user model, pop that in here. Okay. And I think that's actually enough of a test, but just to be silly, we could say that is equal to that. All right, so this is a new test at the models layer, which is what's going to force me finally to make that change in models.py. List has no attribute user. Fine. Owner is an invalid keyword, list models.py. And here's when I'm going to go models.foreign key user default equals none, blank equals true, now it's true. Yeah. Have I still got this thing? Yeah. All right, fantastic. So that's going to be that guy. Run that one to make sure there's none of those. Python manage.py. Make migrations. Manage.py. Migrate. Run my tests. Fine. So I've got my models layer test is now passing. That lets me pop back up the stack to the views layer. And here's where I can go to list views.py and actually say, oh, right, well, list underscore dot owner equals request dot user. List underscore dot save. And then I'm making a deliberate mistake here, but just to point out that your unit tests are there to save you from making dumb changes. If the user is not authenticated, which most of the tests assume, then you can't save list.owner. So I need that little guard in here. Shoop. Great, thank you very much. All right, so I've moved down from the templates layer to the views layer to the models layer. Then I'm popped back up to the views layer to get that test passing. And now I think I've kind of got all of the piping working. Should we run the functional tests and see if they pass? Who thinks they might pass? No one. There you go. Let's just see it for sure. R functional. What do you think is going to happen? Will it get further in the test? Yes, it might. We've at least got a template there, and we know that we're associating lists with users in that view, but unable to locate element. Okay, fine. So let's go now and have one more look at my list templates base.html. Not base, my list.html. Oh yeah, of course, I haven't actually put any of the lists in here. And so this lets me do a second round of outside in, where I'm going to do a little bit more kind of programming by wishful thinking here. And I'm going to say for, and so here are the bits where I'm starting to go, there's a bit of interference there. These are the bits where I'm starting to go, okay, well, what would be convenient to be able to do in this template? And so I'm going to drive the requirements from the view that serves my lists from the template rather than doing it the other way around. So here, for example, I might want to be able to do for list in user underscore lists, or I might say, okay, you know what? I know that the user is available, so I could go user dot, and I happen to know that Django gives you this sort of user.listset.all. Or I might decide that that's ugly. So these are the places where you start to make decisions about what kind of API you need from the layer below. And so I'm going to have a list item, so that means a UL in here, an end UL in there. Okay. And I'm going to have an A, an href equals. Okay, so I need to be able to go from a list object. I need its URL. So if I didn't have that already, I might want to be able to go list.url, but I know that I'd get absolute URL that exists. absolute URL. And in here, I'm going to need to have a reference to a list's name, and the list is named after its first item. So if I want to use Django magic, I would do something list dot, who knows their Django magic? How do I get the item text of the first item in a list? Yep. So you could do something like this, dot first dot text. But you might decide that, you know what, that's a little too ugly, and here I'm going to drive a requirement from my lower level API that list should have a dot name attribute. And li. So there's a nice way of saying, you know, when you, instead of like jumping into models.py and going, hey, it'd be nice if list had a dot name attribute, what I'm going to say is the places that's actually going to use that is the code that I write first, and then I'm sure that it's going to have the right, or the API that I really need. So I need a list.name. Which is going to be a little bit like that. Test name. And it's going to need some items. Oops. And then we have one more little hop of unit tests to code. Yeah. How about that? Okay. All right, the moment of truth. Who thinks it's going to cast this time? Let's have a look. We can see it happening on screen. First list, second item. Maybe it's going to fail for the spurious reason of the... Look at that. Edith, the example then, first list, first item, second list, first item, and that is a passing test. Your instructor is competent, everyone. Half an hour flat. Good. So that was like my little mini demonstration of outside-in TDD. I hope that the live coding pain wasn't too serious. Right. So what do you think about that, everyone? Does that look good? Do you all swear now to go and use outside-in for every single piece of code that you write from now on? No. Maybe not. And I don't think I wouldn't always use outside-in either. But I'm just trying to give a little demonstration of like why you might be interested in it, why it might be a good idea. So who remains unconvinced about this approach? Now, or who can think of some places where this might not be the right approach? Yes? If you don't have any specification for the front end. Yeah. If you're more of a data-driven. Yeah, yeah. So maybe you're just an API or something. Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. But you've still got a front end and a back end. It's just that your front end happens to be REST endpoints, and your sort of high level, your kind of end-to-end tests are going to be things that maybe do HTTP requests with gets and posts and puts and whatever. And that's going to be your outside layer. And then your inner layer is, you know, at some level, you're going to have maybe some views that are in charge of returning REST, and then there's some things that are in charge of fetching stuff from the database, and then there's maybe some files that are in charge of putting some business logic of saying if the user is authenticated, they should do that, or if the person is above their account balance, then you should return 0. All that sort of stuff. You are going to still have layers in your architecture, and you can still implement outside-in in that if you like. So there are, you know, unless you've got a single file piece of Python code, there are always layers that you can think about, and there are always ways that you can approach the problem from the outside in, thinking about it. Yeah, I think. Does that sound convincing? Oh yeah, you just made a positive face, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the places where I wouldn't use this is where, like, right now, I look at that problem and I go, right, the way I solve this at the models layer is I'm going to have a foreign key between list and user, and I have no worries that I'm going to find a solution there. So I can proceed knowing that there's no ground beneath me because I know I'm pretty confident I'm going to be able to create that ground once I need to land on it. Let me strain this analogy slightly. Whereas maybe if there was something like a slightly more complex problem where I wasn't quite sure what the data structure was going to look like or if it was even possible, that's a case where maybe I might not write the final production code from the bottom up, but I might at least do some sort of prototype where I start at the bottom layers and just check that, can I make the database do what I want before I build this feature? So I think there's some places where you would have exploratory coding and that you would still want to go kind of bottom up to make sure you know how to solve the problem. But then you can throw that prototype away and come back and go, okay, well now let's really do it. Given what I need from the UI, let's drive it down, and you might find that the solution you end up with isn't quite the same as what you did in your prototype. Good. What else? Did you find that was an okay demonstration of the outside-in concept? What do you think might have been? Let's see. Yeah, fine. All right. Any other skeptics left in the room, like going, well, I don't know, I'm not going to do that. Because if you don't speak up now, then you're all basically, I mean, you have been recorded. Not that they can see your faces, but I mean, Facebook probably knows who you are just from the kind of sound of your breathing by analyzing the, Google will certainly know from the sound of your breathing the exact identity of every person in this room. So you've kind of publicly committed to using outside in for all of your code from now on, unless you speak up right now and say, no, here, I have a sensible objection. No, come on. This doesn't sound right. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. Right, and I've done this against the backdrop of what I call double loop TDD, or what is called double loop TDD. I didn't invent that. Where you have one kind of loop of end-to-end tests, or functional tests, I call them, which are kind of the high-level ones that use Selenium and then drive stuff through the UI. And then you have a kind of lower level of tests that are unit tests. And you can go to town on this and have more layers of tests if you want them, integration tests in between. But the idea that you have these high-level tests and the low-level ones, and a workflow where you tend to write the high-level test first, it sort of forces you to think about outside in, because you're forced to think about, okay, well, if I'm going to write a test from the point of view of the user, what do they need to be able to click on, and what do they need to be able to see to make this feature work? So I've kind of begged the question in this by saying we have functional tests and we have written them already. So that's forced you to think outside in. And really then writing the code by following those rules is just an extension of the same mindset. It makes a lot of sense. Yes? Yes? No, nothing. All right, well, what I'd like to talk about after the break is the fact that I did cheat at one point. So at some point, I wrote that test for the creating a new list view, which says, all right, if I have an authenticated user, then when they create a list, list.user should be request.user. And I couldn't get that to pass until I went down to the models layer and implemented the foreign key relationship. And that's bad if you think about it, because I've got a really simple app here, almost the simplest possible, and it's just got kind of templates, views, models, maybe forms. But in kind of a more complex business, you're going to have more layers in your application, right? You're going to have views, and you're going to have maybe some business logic somewhere, and you're going to have maybe some third-party APIs. And if at every layer that you write tests, you have to wait until you've completed the code, the layer beneath it, before, so you go layer 1, failing test, go down one layer, write another failing test. Okay, I can't solve that until I do the next layer, write another failing test. So now you've got 3 sets of failing tests, and you're going to go down another layer, and you're going to get another failing test, 4 sets of failing tests, all waiting, and then you're just hoping they're all going to magically solve themselves on the way back up. That doesn't seem so sustainable. And really, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I have no confidence that this top layer is correct yet, because the test is still passing. So I'm just kind of guessing, and I'm going to go down to the bottom layers first. And so you're sort of doing bottom-up after all. And so what I want to do is demonstrate, okay, is there a way of getting the tests at the views layer passing and writing the code at the views layer and getting the correct code at the views layer before the models layer even exists? Is there any way that that's possible, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, there is. What is the answer? Oh, no, it's mocks. Okay, so that's what we're going to do after lunch, and I promise it's going to be fun. After lunch, whatever you call it, break. So off you go to break before the coffee runs out. It's 5 past now. Would you like 10 minutes or 15 minutes? Hands up for 15. Hands up for 10. Oh, hang on. I think the 10s have it. Like, put hands up really high for 10. Hands up really high for 15. Oh, man, it's equal. I don't know. What's that? 12 minutes it is. Okay, fine. It's 15:05 or 15:05 by my watch, so let's meet back here 15:17. Exactly. Thanks, everyone. check, check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Welcome back, everyone. Super clipping. Harry's got his volume too loud. Yeah, I've got a reputation for singing on conference calls in between like awkward breaks between stuff. I think everyone should do that. Just do your own little on-hold music. All right. So here we are, back after the break to do a little bit of stuff with mocks. So hands up if you're unfamiliar with mocks and the way they work in Python. So there's a few people. So what I'm going to do is just a little brief overview of mocks and how they work. And I'm going to do a quick example. And then the next exercise is going to be, we'll try and do this outside-in TDD exercise from the point at which I started cheating yesterday. Yesterday? It's a long time ago. So that is Control-Z. History. So what you're going to want to do is this kind of git checkout intermediate workshop part 2. And that's going to take you to a point at which we've got this kind of code that we've started working on. And this test over here. Fine. And we've got this this failure mode here, which is that we've done basically all the stuff in the templates, all the done kind of boilerplate thing is there, apart from the list.name attribute, which we've got to do with that little property at the end. Our problem right now is, can we actually get these views tests passing, and can we write the code at the views layer before having implemented the models layer? And so the way we can do that is using mocks. And so mocks are a tool for isolating your tests from dependencies from different layers. And they're usually used to say, okay, well, listen, if you have a piece of code that maybe calls out to an API on the internet, like maybe it's going to send text messages or something, and when you write your unit test, you don't want it to actually call out to the real live SMS system, you might use a mock to say, okay, well, I'm just going to substitute this real text message API for a false one. So mocks are, and I'm sure people who've used mocks in this room have often used them for this, like mocking out requests so that actual HTTP requests don't go out on the internet, and you just have fake ones, and you can assert that they were called in the right way. So let's go from unit test.mock, import mock. So mock is a library written by a chap called Michael Ford, who used to work at the company where I learned TDD. So I feel part of an exciting tradition there. And so you can create mock objects. And so what mock objects are different from the practice of mocking. But a mock object is, in Python, in the standard library, is an object that can have kind of any property and any method. And any property and any method on a mock gives you back another mock. So type of another. So it's an object that can appear to do anything. It can have any attribute, and it can also have any method. So we can have m.foo, and there it goes, f equals m.foo. And so f is another mock. But the mock will also keep track of what's happened to it over time. So if I have a mock called m, and I call foo on it, like I have here, I can check on m.foo.called. So it's got a couple of special attributes and properties. So we can have m.foo.call args. And if I go m.foo 1, b equals 3. Boop. So this mock object, I'm not sure if you can see that, scroll off the screen, will have any property. It can have any property and it can have any attribute. It can pretend to be other types of objects. And when you have a mock and you do things to it, like you call methods on it, that mock object is able to tell you about what methods on it were called and what arguments they were called with. So this would be useful in our tests. It'd be useful in our tests to be able to say, okay, well, at the moment, the list class doesn't know how to make a relationship to a user class. But if, during the duration of one of my tests, I was able to swap out the list class for a fake version of the list class, then I could look at what happened to that fake version of the list class over time. And so that might look something like this. Let's do maybe... Okay. So here we're instantiating a list object. We're going to go set its list.owner attribute, and we're calling list.save, form.save. All right, fine. So I think I'm going to do something like this. So there is a syntax, as well as like having a mock object, there's a syntax in unit tests called patch, which lets you say, for the duration of a given test, I want to swap out the following thing for a mock. And you do that over here. I'm going to add patch, import it from unit test.mock, import patch. Boop. And I'm going to say, in the lists module, in the lists package, views module, for the duration of this test, I want the list class to be patched out with a fake version of the list class. And that goes in as an argument called mock list class. And I'm also, for reasons that you'll find out later, going to mock out the, I think it's the item form, so I'm going to mock out all right, fine. This is our syntax. We go at patch, and then for the duration of this test, instead of creating real list objects, which are really going to go into the database, the view function is going to view these fake list objects, and then we can ask the mock classes what happened to them over the course of the test. So instead of trying to fetch the real thing from the database, I'm going to go mock list equals mock list class dot return value. Oh, I could have shown you that in a terminal as well, I suppose. Okay, let's have a look. There's one more thing you need to know about mocks. M equals mock, m.foo, f equals m.foo, m.foo.return value f. Those are the same thing. So not only can you ask a mock whether it was called, what arguments it was called with, but you can also access, if it was called, you can access the mock that was given to the thing that called it via the .return value attribute. Is everyone with me so far? Yes. So one of the problems with mocky tests is they do require this slightly convoluted thinking. Okay, but this is saying, all right, so the mock list is going to be, when I've mocked out my list class, the list objects I try and instantiate during my views code are going to be these mock list objects. And I'm going to say that the mock list .owner should be the user. And with a bit of luck, that might work. Should have just used tabs all the way through. That would have solved my problem, wouldn't it? Great. The test passes. Okay, everyone's not used mocks before. It goes, I don't know what magic you just did, Harry, but well done. Good on you, mate. So let's see if we can just like break that down a little bit. So basically, for the duration of this test, when we call the code inside views.py, if it tries to instantiate a list object, instead of getting a real Django list object, which when you call save on it, saves itself to the database, it gets a mock. When we assign .owner to it, we can have a look at that .owner in our actual test. And when we call .save, it's actually going to call a mock.save method. And so the problem with our current test is, if I comment out this list.save, it still passes. What? Oh, yeah, so the forms, I think that's a failure in a different test. Test redirects after post, yes. Just going to save a post request, yes. Okay, good. So those are unrelated failures. But so the problem is that my actual test with mocks is still passing, because that test is just checking, have you assigned the .owner attribute to an object, but it doesn't check that it was saved to the database. So if I want to check that this is actually happening, I need to do something like self.assert equal mocklist.save.called true. All right, fine. And now I can use mocks to say, okay, did I actually call the save method? And then that's going to let me go in and say, okay, well, I have to call that manage.pytestlists, and now I'm okay again. Great. So what I would like you to do is go ahead and using mocks and unit test.patch, try and get this feature working completely using only so try and get the views layer correct and passing using unit tests that use mock without having the models layer working yet. And then see what, and at the end of it, which should take us about 20 minutes, we'll maybe do a little share about what did our tests look like. So I showed you one way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it. Have a go. When you run into trouble, see if you can figure out why is it difficult, and how, and think about why has this been a painful experience, if indeed it is a painful experience. Yes. Yes, sorry, I'll just remind you of that. History, pipe to grep, checkout. You should be doing git checkout intermediate workshop part 2 for this. So this is the place where you're starting intermediate workshop part 2. And that should give you kind of a half-written old-fashioned test, and I want you to transform that into a mock-based test. And then you've got a half-written implementation, which you should get working. Because the thing I didn't show there is that we're trying to save the user every single time, but that's wrong. We should have an if, and it should only save it if the user is authenticated. So for bonus points, I also want you to do a test where request.user.isAuthenticated is false. And that might be that might be a little harder. Oh, what is it? Okay, so far.
I don't know what it is. I bought it. It's an enormous thing that I bought.
Oh, Christ, it's like a giant donut.
This is half of it.
Wow. All right, I might be interested in that. Maybe. Shoot. So I just put some bits and pieces up there for the advanced exercise of making sure if the user's not authenticated, it should not save. And how would you code that? And I'm hoping you'll get into trouble with that. Okay, everyone. So who's been having fun with mocks? Yeah. And who's been sort of struggling with it and finding it a bit of a, sort of a bit brain melty, a bit tedious, a bit boring, a bit pointless? Yeah, right. So this is not uncommon experience, right? When you're writing tests with mocks, you mock out one little thing and then you find that, oh, okay, hang on, a bunch of other stuff depends on this thing being the real thing, and now that it's a fake thing, stuff doesn't work. So I think I saw almost everyone I walked past had this error saying, form.save cannot work because, a mock list instance and was expecting a real list instance. And so it meant you couldn't just mock out mock list, but you also had to mock out the form class. Over here, please. It's just ego, and I should really stop that. But if I was a teacher, I think I'd make a really good 1940s one. Children, quiet now! I will rap your knuckles. So you found yourself you had to use more mocks, and then we came across this problem of saying, oh gosh, I can get the test passing, but then if I actually comment out the .save, the test still passes, but the implementation is broken. So then you can write a test that, mock list class .return value .save .called is equal to true, and then you can get that passing. And then if you so if you get that working, then the implementation we had was always saving, even if request.user was not authenticated. So we had to write a new test class that would check the request.user is false, and that was kind of hard. And you might find yourself writing more mocks. And this is a good point at which you might sort of give up in disgust and say, look, outside in is all very well, but if I have to use mocks to do outside in, I'm not really prepared to do it. And I will either cheat, like we did before, and just go, fine, I'm just going to leave this test failing at this layer and go down to the layer beneath, and then come back, which I think is fine. And honestly, in this particular case, I think that's absolutely fine. You've got 3 layers, fine. You can't get one layer quite to pass before the layer below does, all right. But yeah, what if you had loads more layers? Then you might have to just give out on the idea of outside in altogether, and I think that'd be a shame. So what I like to do for the rest of the session is do a little demo of, okay, well, let's really see this through to the logical extreme and kind of follow through using these mocks. And instead of just kind of sort of accepting when testing with mocks is making things really uncomfortable, we're going to do something else, which you might have heard in the kind of TDD jargon, which is called listen to your tests. So I think we probably want to undo all of this. Okay. Okay. So what have I got here? I think this was R1. And Python manage.py test lists. It's passing. Views.py. Okay. And then what if we did this? Okay, it still passes. So supposing I wanted to write, I've got my mocky test. It mocks out the item form, which seems kind of pointless because it was irrelevant to that test, but fine, I have to have 2 mocks instead of 1. And now I found that I've opened myself up to a possible bug where I call save before I assign the owner. So this code is broken, but my code is not telling me that this test is broken. So how would I get that working? I would go to list, test views, oh, look, I didn't know that well like that. Views.py, and I could say, for example, where's mock? Let's see, so you can do a thing called def check owner assigned. I think that is going to just be like that. Okay. I've used tabs, haven't I? You guys need to find that hilarious. 4. And up self.assert equal. And we say mock list dot owner. Come on, we're going to have this basically, this assertion here. So instead of doing this assertion inline in the test, I can move it into this little function, and then I can go put over here, put all these 3 up here, okay, and then I'm going to say I want to check when we do mock list.save.side effect equals check owner assign. Who's used mock.side effect in the room? Could you explain what's happening, please, over here? Gentleman in the grey hoodie and red T-shirt. Yes. So it is kind of long-winded. So one of the things you can do with mock is say, okay, before I'm actually going to run my code, the code under test gets run when I do this self.client.post. So it maybe helps to sort of separate that. So in advance of all that, I've mocked out the list class, and I'm saying, okay, here's the mock list object. So what I get back from that mock class is going to be this mock object. And then I'm going to say the .save function. When I call that in views.py, instead of just calling a regular mock, I want to go inside this custom little function, and at the time that save is called, I'm going to assert that mocklist.owner should be the correct thing. So with a bit of luck, when I run that, fine, blah, 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 I get a test failure. And then if I put these back in the right order, I've got something that passes. So fine. That is the test I need to do outside in properly with kind of isolated layers from one another. So I think you'll agree with me in saying that that test was hard to write, it was unwieldy, and it's hard to understand. Right? Like if I just look at that test and I go, what's going on here? Mock list, check owner assigned, post, a save called. This is not as obvious a test as it used to be. And that's a bad thing. So here we could just go, okay, forget mocks altogether. Or I can say, all right, well, so why is this so hard to deal with? And the answer is that I've got, so the thing we can say, why is this so hard to deal with? And maybe the test, when you find yourself working with tests and they're unwieldy, and this can happen whether you use mocks or not. If you're doing some tests and there's loads of setup and you make all the assertions and the assertions are convoluted, maybe what that's telling you is that the code under test is ugly in some way. So if the tests are ugly, maybe the code is ugly, is the kind of code smell here. And the code smell here is like if I look at this new list method, like this is meant to be a really simple view. All it does is it takes a look at some input the user has sent us, it validates it, and then it should save it if we've got some correct stuff, or it should show you some errors if we've got some incorrect stuff. So it should really be instantiate a form, if this, do this, else do that. It should kind of feels like this view should be kind of 3 or 4 lines of, 4 lines of code, but it's not. It instantiates a form, and then it creates a list object. So it's kind of mixing layers already, right? The views layer is calling to the forms layer, which is kind of one layer, but it's also calling 2 layers down to the models layer. And so views is depending not just on the models layer, but also on the forms layer. Sorry, not just on the forms layer, but also on the models layer. And so we're creating forms, but we're also calling list save, and so on. And so what this is trying to tell us is like, okay, wouldn't this test or wouldn't this sort of somehow be simpler if I didn't have to instantiate a list object manually? What if we said that was the forms job and we had some code that looked a little bit more like this? Form.save, like this, for list equals, so I'm going to say user equals request.user. Right, so why, look at that. Wouldn't that be a much nicer view? Wouldn't that be a view that makes more sense and is understandable? And then we're saying, okay, listen, a form that's in charge of doing validation can be the thing that's in charge of saying, okay, let me look at this user, and if this user is authenticated or not, I can decide. So we've said forms are in charge of saving stuff to the database, but we were also saving stuff to the database in the views. It's because we hadn't really made up our mind about where the responsibilities lied in this view. And if I wanted to write a mocky test for this function, it would be much easier, because the only thing I have to mock out now is the item form class. Now let's see if I can actually get that working. But the point is that my view function had too many collaborators, and the fact that I had loads of mocks was pointing out who all the collaborators of my view function were, and it was trying to tell me maybe there's too many here. If you only had one, your life would probably be easier. Let's see if we can actually make that work. Sorry? Oh yes, so I should probably do something like a new list or something. I got rid of one of those list underscore. No, that won't work. List. Yeah. So let's see if I can't get that to work somehow. So, what would a test for that look like? Well, instead of having to mock out both the item form and the list, it's going to maybe just mock out the item form. And instead of all doing this sort of stuff, I might go self.client.post, and I want to do something like mock form equals mock item form dot return value. And over here, I'm going to say something like mock form dot save was called. And I'm going to check on its call arg. So what was this form dot save called with? So I want to check that my form over here was called with the request user object. So I'm going to say call args equals call. So I need call from mock. So my test is going to use something more like this. And that's more understandable. It has the same kind of setup that we have before. We set up a user and we log them in, and then we check just one thing. Did I call form.save correctly? So let's see if that'll work. Obviously not. And I consider myself a humorist, and I like to make jokes in my tutorials, and I'm slightly annoyed that the funniest thing so far is the fact that I'm getting tabs instead of spaces. All right, fine. Near simple lazy object. So I think that's saying that I haven't mocked out the form correctly. User equals simple lazy object, right, fine, is not equal to a call user equals. Okay, well, so I think that's because it should be like this. All right, so one of the annoying things about mocks is that positional and keyword arguments are different. You have to be exactly the same in your tests and your implementation, which is slightly annoying. Fine. Okay, and now that's happening, and I think we'll find that these are actually different tests. So that is now redirects after post. Yeah, exactly. So test can save a post request. But notice that my actual test is now fine. Now the trouble is that we now have to kind of go all in on this. And we have to say that all of our views tests are all going to mock out the item form. But then that's all right, because what they end up looking like is something pretty nice. So let's have a look at this one, say, which is test redirects after post. And where's test can save a post request? How many tests failed? 2. So where's can save? So this one as well, we can do our little mock and see what it would look like if we pursue this all the way. So here, rather than checking we've got actual items in the database, we're going to check something fairly similar, which is going to say that, okay, did we call the item form with the right kinds of things? So we're going to need a request.user, so it's going to be, I think I can get it from user equals self.client.whiskey request.user. Yeah, and the other thing we need to take, so the important thing about this is rather than checking that the view is able to specifically save something to the database, we're kind of now just testing this view in isolation. So instead we're not checking, did you save anything to the database, we're saying, did you do the right thing with this form that you're supposed to collaborate with? And the things that it's doing are, it's calling save on it, but it's also instantiating. So we want to just check that it's passed the data from the post request to the form. So that kind of assertion looks like this. Mock item form. Actually, it's going to be this stuff. yank around curlies. Something like that. Let's see if that might work. Hooray! Okay, no, not hooray. Did I forget to close brackets? Yes. All right. All right. So I don't know if I want to live code this entire thing for you slowly and laboriously. So instead, at this point, I think I'm going to maybe switch to some pre-prepared code examples. So let's have a look at them over here. All right, so this was an example of the kind of mocky thing that you might get in trouble with. And this is where we got to, is saying, okay, well, what if the form.save actually took an owner object? Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, yeah. More, less, bit less, like that? Is that okay at the back? Yep, all right, fine. So we can get into mocks that look a little bit more like this. And then we have to adjust all the rest of them, but you can see that they only have the sort of one collaborator, and then the two that really specifically need to check the redirects and renders, we can mock those out as well. So we can have tests that are arguably as readable, or perhaps at least not as horrible as they were, as long as we listen to our tests and listen to them saying that, you know, the functions that you're testing have got too many collaborators, and if you could make them have fewer collaborators, then your tests would be easier, you could get this view layer to look nicer. But the problem is that you then need to pursue this down to the next layer, right? I've just sort of arbitrarily specified that form.save should now take an owner object, but I haven't implemented that yet. And so unlike in the previous case, I now need to go into test forms.py and refactor my forms class to say instead of being called with a list object, it's called with an owner object. And you kind of get into the same sort of story. So if the form.save now takes an owner, then it needs to instantiate a list object, it needs to check if the owner is authenticated, and then it's going to call, it's going to assign the owner if there is an authenticated user, then it's going to call save, then it's going to create an item, blah, blah, blah. And so that is then going to end up with, just as we had ugly, mocky tests in our views layer, we've just pushed that ugliness down to the forms layer, and we now get this horrible thing where we've got to like mock out both list and item, and we have sort of a side effects-based test again that's going to check that mock item.text is equal to the mock underscore list, and the, you know, the mock item.save.side effect, and all this sort of stuff. And so again, like you've done loads of work, you've refactored loads of tests of the views layer, and you've just found that the ugliness has gone down to the forms layer, and you might just be like, okay, fine, well, you know, all I've done is moved ugliness from A to B, let's give up. And so I'm going to encourage you to say, no, okay, yuck again, but this is another opportunity to listen to your tests. Your poor forms class has got too many collaborators again. Forms is looking at lists, and it's looking at items, and it has to know that lists are instantiated in the following way, and they have the owner attribute, and that items have a .text, and that you have to assign them via a foreign key, and all this sort of thing. So the forms has loads and loads of knowledge about the models layer, and if we could simplify that somehow, if maybe the models layer gave us a helper function, like say list.createNew, or if there was just a function that simply took the two things the form knows about, which is what your item text is and an optional owner, that would be a much nicer API for my form to use, and I could simplify the code at my forms layer. And I can write some tests using mocks for this that are much more readable. And then finally, I get down to the models layer, and I'm going to say, okay, my models layer needs a helper function that takes a piece of item text and an optional owner and knows how to save that to the database. And you're going to say, okay, well, now my mock stuck here. Well, this is the point at which I can say, no, the buck stops here. Once you're testing code that's at the models layer, the whole point of the models layer is to integrate with the database. And this is the point at which you can say, okay, fine. If these tests use the real database, that's fine. And the tests that you end up for this little helper list.createNew function, they can actually use the real database. They don't use any mocks. They're really straightforward to read and understand. And you get to the end of this exercise at every stage of looking at ugly tests with ugly mocks, of forcing yourself to refactor your code and moving what you might call kind of domain logic or model logic down to the models layer where it belongs. So like, why did the views care about how to instantiate a list object? Why did the forms even care about how specifically the relationship with lists and items? That is stuff that all belonged in models.py, really, is the lesson from that. So that's the kind of little story that we get through if we sort of follow the logic of letting the mocks drive out the design in our code. And so when you, some people, if you listen to TDD enthusiasts, they say, look, one of the points of test-driven development isn't so much having tests that tell you whether your code is correct or not, but it's also trying to give you clean code. And this is one of the ways in which it does it, is when you find testing uncomfortable or inconvenient, it's one of the ways it's trying to give you feedback on your design. You're finding that when I try and use my code, I have a bad time. That means maybe my code isn't designed right for the purposes I put it to. So the final exercise that I'd like to do today, I think we have 15 minutes, is that once we get down to this station, we drive out a lovely little bit of code. We move all the complexity down to the models layer where it belongs. We still end up with a bug, which I'd like you to take a look at and debug, and that's going to be the final lesson, which is that you can do all this stuff with mocks, but you are opening yourself up to possible pitfalls, and we'll see if we can spend a little wrap-up talking about what those are and how to fix them. So see if you can check out, so let's see, right, Control R, Part 2, Intermediate Workshop Part 3. Yep. I'll just show you around this forms.py. So I got this little new create new function in models.py. I've got this lovely create new function. It's a sort of static method on the log subject. It knows how to convert some item text and an optional owner into the right kind of list and item objects. And the views.py similarly are really nice and simple. So that's nice. All the unit tests pass, 41 tests and 0 point. But if I run test my functional, functional, yeah, very good. If I run my functional tests, I'm going to find that there's all kinds of tracebacks coming out of the code, and my functional tests are broken, and I get errors equals 1, and if you run all the functional tests, like 65% of them are broken. So we've got lovely mocks, we've got a much nicer design in the code, but somehow we've opened ourselves out to a bug. And so I want you to just have a quick look around there and see if you can figure out what the bug is and why it happened. All the unit tests pass, the functional tests fail, and we've got errors and tracebacks in our server logs. What's happened here and why? All right. Has anyone found the answer yet? Anyone think they're close? Anyone? Yes? Yes? All right, let's do it a little bit like we'll call this, you've heard of pair programming. There's a concept called mob programming, where instead of having two people, you just have everyone. And everyone in the whole company stands around one computer screen and they just all shout out different stuff at the same time. Apparently it's great. It sounds like it's going to be a disaster. But I've done it once in a tutorial. It went pretty well, actually. So let's mob program this. Where shall we start? So here's our kind of traceback. And then where have we got? Yeah, run server. Fine. No? Where's our traceback for the functional test? Here, this thing here. So who's had a little look into this none type is not iterable error? Yes, yes. What do you think it might be? What's it to do with? Where's it coming from and why? No, we'll go ahead and we'll give us some pointers. We'll do it together, yeah. Yes. So the redirect has no list to redirect to. Exactly, we're on the right track. So when we look at a traceback, you just go, okay, fine, it's indecipherable. Argument of none type is not iterable. It's not an understandable thing. But we can say, okay, which line of my tests is causing this? We can't tell because this is coming directly from the server rather than from a test process. But we should look back and look through, in a good big traceback, you go, there's a bunch of Django bits in this traceback, but there is one bit of my own code, and that's this bit over here, views.py line 17 in new list. And it's saying redirect list, none type is not iterable. So if I foreground this one, elist views, 17 was it? Okay, fine. So over here, it's getting none type is not iterable. So it's trying to do a redirect to something that's a none type. So why would list be none? It looks like form.save is returning none. So views.py is expecting form.save to give me back a list, but form.save is giving me back none. So let's have a look at list forms.py. Where is our, where's our item form? Here. This thing over here is our form.save, and sure enough, this fave method doesn't have a return value. So all of our tests were saying, did we call list.createNew, and that's working fine. But what we forgot is that this code needs to do return list.createNew, return list.createNew, right? So that's the bug there. So I should be able to just rerun that and run my tests, and everything will be fine, and we're hunky-dory. It was a tiny little bug, and we can, oh, wait, okay, no, not quite, fine. It's still saying, well, let's have a look at the actual traceback if you like. It's still saying it's not working, fair enough, new list, redirect list, none type is not iterable. Well, hang on, I am definitely returning it. I'm returning the return value of list.createNew, and list.createNew, okay, that doesn't return anything. So this guy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, return list, this guy needs to return a list object as well. And so with a bit of luck with that, see there's no tracebacks coming back. Sorry? Yes. Return. Well, at least it's not failing anymore. And so now this is failing because the name method is not ready. But that was our bug. So why did that happen? Basically, we looked at our code. We started isolating all the layers from each other. And we just tried to make sure that each layer was doing the right thing. So list, tests, test views, or test forms, in fact, patches its one collaborator and so on. And we were like kind of checking that each one was doing the right thing. But what we sort of forgot about is that each layer has a sort of implicit contract with the layer beneath it. If I program by wishful thinking and I say, this layer, it would be great if it had a form.save that took this argument, I sort of forgot that I also needed form.save, not just to take this argument, but also return this value. And so when you're programming like this, you have to think not only in terms of what would I like my API to be like, what would make for nicer tests, but also each time you make a switch between one layer and another, you are defining an implicit contract, and you have to reflect that in the tests for the next layer. So when I go to form.save and say, oh, it should take an owner, it should also return a list, and that's something I need to make a mental note of something or keep track of. And that's hard. Like keeping track of stuff as a programmer is difficult. So, this was opening us up to bugs. Now, thankfully, our functional tests are there, and the functional test caught this bug. So we were saved, and the testing, TDD didn't let us too far astray, but it did let us go quite far down a garden path without realizing that using these mocks was opening up a bug that we didn't realize was there. So that is definitely a risk, and the two solutions to it are, number one, always keep track of your implicit contracts and try and make sure that you're being rigorous about that, which is hard. And the second choice is, always have another layer of tests to back you up. And in this case, the functional tests are there, and they had tracebacks, and they helped us to find a bug. What would help us find that bug even faster is if we had a layer of tests that was in between the low-level unit tests and the high-level functional tests that just checked somehow that the different layers were integrated together. And so that's why you might have you'll hear people talking about integration tests versus isolated tests. And so depending on how complex your architecture is, you might find there's a good justification not only for doing this thing where you isolate all the layers from each other and you use mocks and you use that to drive out your design, but you might also find a justification for having like a third layer of tests in between the really high-level functional tests and the low-level unit tests that kind of just check some of the glue between your layers. That sounds like an awful lot of tests, I hear you say. Well, yes, and if they're all adding value, then that's a good thing. So what? Yep. Yeah, here we are. Command Shift plus, a bit bigger. Can you all read this? A bit bigger? It's annoying that it jumps down every time. So this is my sort of summary and recap for the end. Is that readable? Don't say yes if you mean no. All right, fine. So you might end up with integration tests, what I'm here calling integrated tests. This is another stupid terminology war. But you have these three different types of tests. And the way to think about them is like, are they all worth having? And what kind of value do I get from each one of them? Well, I think we saw over the course of today that the top level, the functional tests, are the only ones that can really tell you whether it does really work in real life, actually. So these are the bits that take all of the moving parts of your infrastructure, actually stick them together, and run them end to end. And they are the tests that give you the most reassurance that your code is correct and it works from the user's point of view. But they have downsides. They're slow, and when they do point to bugs, those bugs are sometimes hard to track down. So that problem with redirect blah, that was not directly in my test traceback. It was in another traceback that was coming out the logs of the server, and I had to find it, and there were several different ones. So those tests are slow, and they don't give you feedback as fast. You run them less often. But they're the ones that most reassure you that your code is correct. Then jumping down to the bottom layer, if we put in the effort to sort of isolate our layers from each other, it was only by doing that I had the impulse to say, hang on, my views.py is too complicated. My list function has got too many collaborators. Like, if I was just happily coding along and I never bothered to use those mocks, I might never have bothered to do that. Now, with such a simple application, I like to hope that I would notice that something is ugly and complicated, and I feel like maybe I would refactor it. But I'm using a simple example because this is just a tutorial, and I can't show you some massive enterprise architecture with 10,000 lines of code. But perhaps in a bigger application, doing this exercise of really isolating your layers from one another is the thing that's going to give you the most feedback about your design. And so those highly isolated unit tests that use mocks or that isolate the layers from one another are the best tests for giving you feedback about your design, about telling you, is my design easier, is it complicated, is it hard to use, is it hard to test, because that indicates problems in your design, in your architecture, I guess. And then the integrated tests, particularly with Django, when Django gives you the Django test client, which says, here you go, and I'm going to magically create a database for you, and in this, you'll get all the layers of the Django kind of stack, and you can call self.client.get, and it's going to go through urls.py, and blah, 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 blah. Django makes those really easy to write, and they help sort of tell you that things are glued together, but they are also slow. So if you have a suite of 10,000 tests that all use the Django test client and all use the Django test database, they get pretty slow. And running those tests might take 20 minutes. Right? And when you've got a whole unit test suite that tests 20 minutes, what you find is developers no longer run that, and so now you have to rely on CI, and if the CI server only runs once an hour, then people check in code, and you only find out an hour later that it's broken, and then the person who wrote that broken code has gone off to lunch, and now you've got 3 hours to wait before. So the fact that code tests are slow can be a real problem. But on the other hand, having some sort of level of integration testing can also warn you of errors quicker than your functional tests. So it's really about these three things that we want from our tests. We want them to give us clean code. We want them to give us code that works, find bugs for us and protect us from mistakes. We want them to help our workflow. So we want our tests to help us develop quickly and not slow us down. And we want our tests to give us feedback about our design, to help us to write clean, well-architected code. And I think all three different types of tests have got a different role to play in that. And so when you're trying to decide from your own code bases which tests are going to give me the most value, see if you can categorize them into these three, or see if tests in each of these different three categories make the most sense for you. Functional tests are the end-to-end ones that are really going to test that everything works. But if you're really, if the way you glue your layers together is trivially simple, and it almost never breaks, then maybe you don't need functional tests. Maybe just lower-level tests is enough. Integrated tests are the simplest to write. They glue loads of layers together, but if you've got quite a simple app, maybe that's all you need. If you're building a simple Django app, maybe you don't need to go through this madness of mocks and stuff. And then finally, the lower-level unit tests, if you have got a bigger and more complicated architecture, these are the ones where you can start to think about that. And someone was asking me earlier how, when I'm building a GUI application, it feels like all the layers are kind of stuck together. If you start trying to force yourself to write unit tests that really do use mock, that isolate layers from one another, it might help you to tease out where those layers should be, who collaborates with what, and how can I make it simpler. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. All of that was true. I hope you enjoyed it. Are there any questions? Yeah. Does that all make sense? Okay. Who's going to go out and write loads more mocky, highly isolated, pure unit tests as soon as they get home? Because you've all already committed to doing outside in for everything. So are you going to do it with mad mockiness? Yes, sir.
Definitely some things I have to write them. Maybe, I'm not entirely sure I'm going to get time to actually write them.
Yeah.
But at least thinking about writing them, I hope can help me,
You're really big on doing things in theory and thinking about them rather than actually doing them. It's not bad, man, but I think you're trying to have the best of both worlds, and you're trying to have all the benefits without going through any of the pain. And let me tell you, it was only the pain that actually gave us any benefit in this one. Yeah. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what I would say is maybe you don't have time to always do this for every project, but practice it as much as you can when you have a bit of time off or when you're working on a new project or things like that. These are all things that you get better at with time, and you have to try and find time to practice them. Yes. There's a question from a man in purple. No, it's gone. The man in purple really wants coffee. There you go. Any more questions? Yes?
Do you see type checking as a replacement for
I am not touching that one with a 10-foot pole. No, look, I've never really used static languages or Python's type whatever you call it, type hinting madness, which I still think is evil. But that's a stupid opinion, because I've never used it. So I can't talk confidently about that. But yes, a lot of people do, and they'll say it will save you from lots of testing, not all testing. And by all means, go and check out strongly typed languages or statically typed languages or whatever the correct terminology is. But Elm, basically, and Haskell. Right, carry on. And Idris. Yeah, Idris is the best of all, I'm told. Yes, good. All right, everyone, well, thanks very much for your patience. Thanks for bearing with my live coding. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Wait. If you enjoyed this, there is more material available, because I actually wrote a book about all of this stuff. So if you enjoyed this bit, or if you want to revise it, read it in my book. There's loads more stuff on continuous integration, different types of tests, how to throw them all together, how to do a deployment to an actual server and test it, using the functional testing tools that we've built here. So all of that stuff and more is available for free on my website, betatestinggo.com, but you can also buy it in all good bookshops. I'm signing books tomorrow morning about 10 o'clock. And thank you very much for coming once again. You've all been wonderful, and good night. Hooray!